There's no hitting the snooze button on this wake-up call. Germany's chancellor-in-waiting, savouring victory in Sunday's federal elections, while at the same time taking stock of what he faces, with the Putin and Trump-backed far right in Germany finishing a strong second. Friedrich Merz stating that his country and his continent could no longer rely on the United States for their defense. Merz stepping out of the shadow of the woman who in a previous life beat him to the CDU's leadership, Angela Merkel, who in her day tried the soft touch on both Trump and Putin. We'll ask what's changed since this photo was taken in 2018. And on this, the third anniversary of Vladimir Putin's all-out invasion of Ukraine, with the French president in Washington for a try at keeping the U.S. on side, all the while leading a push for European strategic autonomy. We'll be asking if Germany's all in and if it's serious about taking EU federalism to a whole new level. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if Sunday's election could prove a turning point for Germany and perhaps even for Europe. Joining us, he was a diplomatic advisor to Helmut Kohl and German ambassador to NATO, Joachim Bitterlich. Many thanks for being with us. With us as well from Brussels, German Green member of the European Parliament, Michael Bloss. Welcome back to the show.
Hello.
We also want to welcome academic Miriam Dageford, assistant professor of comparative politics at the American University of Paris. Welcome. And entrepreneur and commentator Jakob Hessler. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. Yeah, there's plenty for the history books in Sunday's vote. Highest turnout since reunification in 1990. Worst showing for the incumbent Social Democrats since 1887. Strongest show since World War II for the far right. And after a bruising campaign, Friedrich Merz already offering up concessions, not for the cross-party talks on forming a coalition, but saying he's in talks with other parties to reform the country's debt brake before the new parliament comes into effect. This with a clear eye to borrowing more on defense. Merz and Germany clearly scrambling after the events of the past month. Emerald Maxwell has more.
Coming from the lips of an avowed transatlanticist, Friedrich Merz's words were all the more striking.
I would never have thought that I would have to say something like this in a TV show, but after Donald Trump's remarks last week, it is clear that this government does not care much about the fate of Europe.
Merz and European leaders were blindsided by President Donald Trump when he spurned both Europe and Kyiv to start to hold talks with Russia on ending the war in Ukraine. And again, when his administration warned that the United States was no longer primarily focused on Europe's security, stepping back from guarantees in place since the Second World War.
Because you can't make an assumption that America's presence will last forever.
Merz says that he will continue to seek good ties with the United States, but is preparing for the worst-case scenario, and that Europe and NATO need to adapt fast.
My top priority is to make Europe strong enough so that we can be independent from the US as quickly as possible. I am very interested to see how we will navigate towards the NATO summit at the end of June, whether we will still talk about NATO in its current form or whether we will have to establish an independent European defence capability much more quickly.
Unlike its neighbours France and the United Kingdom, Germany is not a nuclear power, and the country is particularly vulnerable to the whims of Trump's administration, as it's long relied on the United States for its security. A legacy of World War II and the Cold War, Germany has dozens of American military bases and 35,000 US troops stationed, more than any other country apart from Japan.
Is it a turning point, Joachim Bitterlich?
Yes, I think so. I'm convinced. We are at a turning point. It's not from yesterday. It has begun a bit earlier. And I think Merz was right to declare this in a clear, understandable way now.
It's a turning point. What was the tipping point that led him to speak so bluntly?
Well, the first, let's call it, declarations of Donald Trump of the last weeks, with the non-presence of Europe with regard to the invasion of Russia to Ukraine and potential peace talks. And the same applies, by the way, to the Middle East. Europe is nowhere. There is no European foreign policy, and the Germans and the Europeans have to reflect on what I call, or what Macron has been calling, strategic autonomy to a certain extent with regard to the Americans. This applies especially, and Merz has been talking about this too, if France and Britain are ready or not to take over a certain part of a nuclear defense of Europe, together with the Americans. I think Merz is convinced that the Americans stay with regard to the nuclear protection, yes, but whatever that means, again, what will be, let's say, the stage where the Americans are interfering with nuclear weapons or not? We should not speak now about scenarios insofar. I would perhaps shock French TV people about this, but this has to be a subject. And by the way, when you talk about strategic autonomy, the first question to put to the Americans is a simple one. Are we allowed, we Europeans, to use SHAPE, the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Mons in Belgium, for autonomous operations of the Europeans or not? And I still remember we had certain talks about this 30 years ago with the Americans. And the Americans were extremely reluctant towards any European caucus or any European autonomous, let's say, force. They wanted to maintain this, what I call, under American control. And this has changed. And it's clear now. It had begun with Obama. It's now with Trump. It's utmost clear. The Europeans have to take their responsibilities much faster than the Europeans have been thinking. It's not the time till 2030 or 2035. No. Begin now, please.
Michael Bloss, the headline this morning on the French radio and in French newspapers, under normal circumstances, would have been far-right historic results since World War II. But actually, Friedrich Merz's statements on Europe's defense have grabbed the spotlight. Are you surprised?
As the former speaker was saying, I'm not surprised, because what Merz said, I think, is also common knowledge. I think also the old government was of the understanding that we are now alone in Europe. The question now is rather, how do we actually manage to keep Europe together? And here I see some difficulties. As you said in the beginning, in order to actually increase our defense spending in Europe, we need to find a solution with the German debt brake, but the same applies for Europe. And here I'm not sure if the conservatives of Germany are ready to also invest into or a big defense fund on the European level, which I think is needed.
So you're saying, Michael Bloss, because Friedrich Merz announcing earlier this Monday that the negotiations have begun with parties that are present in the outgoing parliament and that have a big stake, like, for instance, the Liberal FDP, which won't be in the next government. You're saying that those negotiations on reforming the debt brake in Germany to allow for more defense spending should also take place with countries that are so-called the frugal four they talk about, countries like the Netherlands that are against borrowing at the European level?
Yeah, I think the same debate we have in Germany is also happening on the European level. And in Germany, it's interesting that at least the conservatives are now open to have a solution before the new parliament comes into power. But I think for the European level, it will be much more difficult because, as you said, we have some frugals. Also, maybe some countries, we doubt whether they would spend it well. I mean, what happens to Hungary? So there are some open questions, and the conservatives in Germany were always against a more loose debt policy on the European level. So this is, I think, more the question if Merz now really becomes this leader and understands the situation and also takes action on the European level.
So, Miriam Degeford, could the Frugal Four become the Frugal Three, listening to Friedrich Merz?
I guess there's an opportunity that this is going to happen. We have, however, going to see how Friedrich Merz is dealing with the negotiations on both on the national level and on the European level. Because what he is going to do is that he is going to implement a very new policy in different fields now. Obviously, that was remarkable what he was saying in the first...
Were you surprised?
Yes and no. I would say yes, because he was very direct. Also, his reference to the NATO was very, very strong and was something which was never going to happen before like that. I do think, however, that he knows, he was very clear about the fact that he knows that the situation is pressing, that Germany as well as Europe is really under threat maybe, but also in danger to forget about its own security, right? And I do think that was very remarkable, the shift that we saw yesterday in this conference, also having him sitting next to Olaf Scholz, who had kind of a different policy in this regard. He was very clear, he was very proactive, and there was much energy, or a different kind of energy behind.
We heard a clip in that report, Jakob Hessler, where he talks about the next NATO summit, which is taking place in Washington in June, sort of setting a deadline.
I don't think it's the deadline is a self-imposed deadline. I think it's ourselves. I think the question is how much can Europe get done before to come with a halfway aligned position, which I think is the real difficulty. And it's not just money. And I think it's also tied to economic policy. And I think that's where you said it was long in the making. I think the strategic shift has been long in the making. There were meetings with the Biden administration about Ukraine way before the American elections, where the Europeans were flabbergasted that the Americans did not at all consider them to be a party that had to sit at a table, except that they all liked Joe Biden and wanted him to win. So they were not protesting. It was just all subdued and no one heard about it. Same thing, Inflation Reduction Act was an incredibly hostile act by the Biden administration against Europe, European economy, European business. I mean, not European businesses, but the European national economies. And I think what happens now is due to the radically, let's say, advanced style of Mr. Trump. I think that fundamental shift is now become so visible that you cannot, even as a very transatlanticist diplomat, you cannot ignore it anymore. So you need to formulate a response. And the NATO level, I think, will be the first milestone for which they have to come up with some type of a minimum answer. And I think the shape question is probably the biggest one. It's the question, and there was in the 1950s, there was the question about the European Defense Force. Some people have argued we need to just pick out those old actually plans that were actually quite advanced and which the Americans in those days did not want, because they did not want an independent European defense force. Now, I don't know if they want one, because I think there's still one other threat looming, right, with this old deal making. There's a threat is that NATO becomes the new Warsaw Pact, which is that rather than allies which respect each other based on rules, you become just a vassal to the empire. You know, in the way that...
Yeah, because we've just watched Donald Trump talk up the fact that I think it was one of his cabinet members said that this deal with Ukraine for rare minerals was on the 1 yard line. The deal for rare minerals, is that a good thing? It locks the Americans into guaranteeing Ukraine's defense since they have a stake in it?
Yes.
Or does it make them vassals like you described them?
Well, the question with Ukraine is a vassal of whoever gives them protection. I think it's us becoming the vassals. That's the question. Yes. The question is whether we're going to be next. I mean, from the Frugal Four, Denmark is already increasing its defense spending to 5%.
A different affair.
You know?
With rare materials is a different affair than, let's say, the role of Europe or the place of Europe. It's clear. If the Americans invest in this field, in the Ukraine, it's clear that American companies want to be protected by American forces, if necessary. Full stop. This is another story. Another story is the peace, of the so-called peace talks. And the third question is, what's the role overall in Europe with regard to the US and with regard, what I call, to its own neighborhood? Are the Europeans taken seriously again? And therefore, you are entirely right. the Europeans have to make up a concept, a clear program, till latest June summit of NATO in Washington.
But before we go into delve into what happened in those elections on Sunday, Miriam Deggerford, one last question on this important topic, which is German public opinion. Are they ready to follow?
I do think they are. More than usually was common sense in politics, because when we see the polls, we see that there's.
Because let's add it up: 20% AfD, plus 8.5% for Die Linke, plus a little under 5% for another one of these left-wing parties.
Yes.
That's what? That's 35% who are definitely anti-NATO.
And parts of the SPD and parts of the Greens. Don't forget.
So what percentage of Germans?
I would not say that the parts of the Greens. Because really that's maybe like a very old...
that's in Kreuzberg. Exactly. That's in Berlin-Kreuzberg.
All right.
Yeah, but unfortunately, if you look at the results in Berlin-Kreuzberg, they also changed. But really, it is, if you look into the German party system, it's actually the Greens that have the highest support for Ukraine. So I wouldn't say that the Greens...
Okay, so Miriam Daggerford, what percentage of the Germans are ready to spend more on defense and to back Ukraine?
A lot of them are.
What's a lot? 50%? Two-thirds?
More than that. They are more than that. And it is important for them because it's also, so the discourse in Germany is also about Ukraine and democracy, and this is something that many people perceived, right?
Why is it that the people that are the closest to Ukraine in Eastern Germany are the ones that are the most reluctant?
This is because of the discourse of the AfD. Because the AfD is usually going against what many of these mainstream parties, as you would be saying later, are suggesting, and the AfD is going against it. And we see that in Eastern Germany, a large majority of voters, I'm not sure whether we have it here, is overwhelmingly for the AfD. And this also means that they usually buying, if you want so, the discourse of this party, and by this, the opinions of these voters are shaped in a similar way.
Okay, so again, negotiations over trying to lift that debt brake and to get some kind of a deal before, because that's a constitutional rule. So they have to have a deal before the new parliament comes in.
You have to explain this to TV. Because the problem is, you need for such a change of a debt brake, you need a two-thirds majority in German parliament. Two-thirds means two-thirds out of 630 means 415. And even if you look at the picture you have in...
Or maybe we could show the pie chart from the beginning where we had
even if you integrate the Greens in such a concert, you have 413, just 2 lacking, and therefore... Friedrich Merz has been talking either to use the actual parliament in its last weeks till the 24th of March, still in action, or if you may do this deal integrating Die Linke afterwards.
All right, so the room for maneuver there is a narrow one. The room for maneuver for building a new coalition is also a narrow one. By the way, it could have been much narrower for the coalition building. Sarah Wagenknecht's left-wing nationalist party came in on 4.972% of the vote, 13,400 votes shy of the threshold needed for her BSW party to enter parliament. Wagenknecht, whose pro-Putin stances would have added voice to a Eurosceptic opposition. Those 13,400 votes, will they matter when the history books are written?
I think they do matter, because you can say it's a difficult coalition negotiation, but it's not as difficult. It's one party. Germans have been generally not completely opposed in the past. It has worked. Now, the real
this would be a coalition between the CDU
and SPD. It's the only possible coalition. So I think it's going to happen. The question to me is whether or not both parties actually draw the conclusions from what they won and what they didn't win. And I think the SPD, in my view, would be well advised to understand to whom it lost votes. It did not. just lose votes to Die Linke, it also lost considerable votes to AfD. And that means they are now in a real difficult situation, because when you go very much towards the left to say, I want to recover the Linke, you will completely lose the labor, the workermen's basis in the way the French left has literally abandoned the working class people. If they don't do that, well, then they will be menaced as being a sort of small social democrat party for the rich in cities, which they don't want either. So it's a really complicated situation.
Michael Bloss, on paper, the chancellor-in-waiting doesn't need the Greens to try to form a coalition. I think it's something like 321 votes or something, which is 315 is the magic number. Would he be well advised to include the Greens in his coalition? Michael Bloss? All right, we seem to have technical issues with Brussels. Can you hear us now, Michael?
I hear you now. I'm reconnected. Yeah.
Yeah. Would it be better for Friedrich Merz to form his coalition just with the Social Democrats, or to include the Greens?
Well, the reality of the election results is that he doesn't need the Greens, so he will only form it with the Social Democrats, and that's normal, and that's fine for us. We were fighting to be part of a government. Now we will be in opposition, but this will be also a good role to control what they're doing.
All right, and you heard a moment ago Jakob Hessler talking about the movings on to the left of the Greens. Sarah Wagenknecht's old party, all smiles, by the way, this Monday. The party of the left, Die Linke, surging to 8.5%. Thanks to a campaign that appealed to youth on bread and butter issues centered around the theme.
TikTok was the key for Die Linke. The key.
Same as in the recent U.S. elections, though, a gender gap emerged from exit polls. Young women, it appears, went more for Die Linke. There you see him in pink, at the purple there at the top of the screen. And when you look at the AfD, it's young men going for that. This is the youth vote in that graph. And that's something seized upon by the leader of the far-right formation.
This is also a strong indicator that we are the party of the future. Young people want perspective for their lives, and we can provide these answers as the alternative for Germany.
Michael Bloss, young women going for Die Linke, young men going for the AfD. Your thoughts?
Even if you look into actually the older voters, then you see that here also even more men go for the right. I would really say they are not a party for the future. They are a party that lives from fear mongering. They are a party without giving real solution for the political problems that we really have. So in this way, we can actually see that, especially with the youth, the more radical parties they won, shows that there is not so much trust into the middle forces. This is something where we have to regain trust. I also don't think it's only TikTok. I mean, we were not as good in TikTok, but they also had really clear messages. And I think these clear messages on social issues that brought, for instance, the left their success. And this is something that we can just say, well, congratulations, and something that we as politicians in the middle have to learn from.
In the middle, we heard the economy minister, Robert Habeck, from your party, as he said he was stepping down as co-leader of the Greens, saying, I decided to trace a centrist path and I stand by it, but he admits that that's not what the voters wanted. Are Germans no longer interested in consensus, in the middle path, like you describe it?
I wouldn't say so. I think it was also a question of campaigning, of messages. If you look at the European Union election results, you had the far right, the AfD, winning the youth. Now it's actually the far left. So it's more about like, can we actually speak to the problems and in a clear way on the media that they are watching? And this is maybe something where center politicians, they were too much concentrating basically on, like normal campaigning, and where the youth, they're just not reading newspapers anymore so much, but they're actually consuming TikTok and Instagram.
Miriam Daggerford?
Yes, I would like to add that we also saw, particularly with the Greens and the SPD, that the rather leftist parties, they have not really taken progressive stances anymore. And by them failing in doing so, the Linke had the big opportunity that they took in a very good way for them, right? To put progressive politics forwards and also to make progressive politics like relatable to the younger generation. And by that, we also saw that many of the voters did go to the Linke.
I see Joachim Bill is shaking his head. Why are you shaking your head?
I have the experience of several campaigns I've been participating in the past. Perhaps another time, but the lesson is the same. What you need if you want to win control over the voter and to win his confidence, you have to be on an offensive stake. It's a key. You have to say clearly, in time, not in the last minute, to the voters what do you want to reach. And my advice has been to friends of the Social Democrats as to friends from the Christian Democrats, please come out with clear ideas on the three key subjects of the German elections early and indicate clearly to the voters what do you want, because you have lost to a certain extent their confidence. It's always more difficult to win back such a confidence but it's awful always to run behind the extremes. We have seen the examples in France, we see it now in Germany. Right. Therefore, take an offensive stake on the three key subjects. This means it's economy, damned, it's the economy, yes. It's the future of the German economy. Second, it's the subject of internal security, especially migration. And third is defense as a new subject. And you have to take a clear and offensive stake on this. Don't run behind the AfD or behind Die Linke. You will never win.
Certainly curbing any hubris for the winners is, even though the CDU finished well ahead of the pack, they're still on 28%, which is a low result for a winning party. When the two Big Ten parties joined forces in Germany, it's happened a lot before. It's called a grand coalition, a GroKo. But it's not quite so grand for the incumbent when his party finishes third on 16%. So that's the Greens. When Olaf Scholz finishes third on 16% and passes the mantle for coalition talks.
But please.
Yesterday was a bitter election result for the SPD, and I want to make it very clear that things have not improved today.
All right, so there you had Olaf Scholz there expressing his bitterness over a bitter election result. Jakob Hessler, now we have Boris Pistorius, his defense minister, who's waiting in the wings, who's, by the way, much more offensive, pardon the pun, when it comes to Ukraine. Is this just the problem of one man who was too cautious, Olaf Scholz, or is the SPD having to go through?
I think it's both. I think there's an element of both, because the leader of the party is always in some way also the incarnation, particularly when it's for a long time, of what he or she stands for, unless he comes to power through a putsch, which wasn't the case. I think the SPD has been struggling since Gerhard Schröder for a programmatic line that redefines what is social democracy. And the problem with that is that they have compensated for that lack of programmatic clarity by spending money, which worked in a certain way to a certain extent, but it didn't evolve. And so when that whole construct of the economy runs because we get cheap gas from Russia, we are defended by the US, and our exports go to China, the SPD in that world, the model sort of works. You make surpluses, which you distribute to the people, and it's happy. But the situation has changed, and the party hasn't. And you had at the helm of a party Someone where you say, just because you're from Hamburg and you call yourself a pragmatist doesn't make you Helmut Schmidt. And I think that's a little bit, they were too confident in the fact that by being statesmanlike and sober and we are so realistic. In fact, they weren't. I think they were closing their eyes to the fact that...
But wasn't that the winning recipe for Angela Merkel? In fact, the jokes about Scholz was that he was called the chancellor-in, the female chancellor, because he was trying to act like her.
Yeah, but
even though she wasn't from his party.
But the times have changed. And have you seen the soul-searching that's going on in Germany now about whether or not, why did Germany not use the incredible budget surpluses it generated in the good years to invest in infrastructure? Like when you look now, trains crumbling, there's no infrastructure, there's not enough digital infrastructure, roads are not. So now we are in the painful process of rebuilding train bridges, railway bridges. And now there's suddenly no money. Well, what happened?
And German industry is leaving the country at the same time.
And German industry is leaving the country. So what happened? And I think that's where there's a soul-searching about...
Is that the Social Democrats' fault?
It's both. It's both. But the fact is the others took the lessons from it. And I think the Social Democrats refused to draw the lessons on some of the things that they were not entirely alone responsible, of course. But they didn't, I think... They didn't take enough distance to that world.
Michael Bloss, if you roll the clock back 3 years, was it a big mistake getting such disparate formations as the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the frugal liberal FDP to try to make a coalition?
But not at all. I think it was a coalition for modernization. That's what they called themselves in the beginning, and that was absolutely necessary. It was just described why. I think it just. I think it's the problem was just when the liberals found out that they were losing and losing, they became basically the break in this whole coalition, and in this way it couldn't continue with its course of modernization. So in this regard, it failed. Unfortunately, the need for modernization is still there, as was also just described. And this is, I hope, what is happening now. Actually, the responsibles for those not to invest were the conservatives. They were also very frugal. They were also insisting on the debt break. And interestingly, on the first day after the election, Merz changed on this. On defense, I hope he will also change on this on infrastructure and other important investments, because otherwise you will just lose.
Just final point on this, Miriam Daggerford.
Yes.
We don't know who's going to replace Olaf Scholz, even in the negotiations over making a coalition. Mm-hmm. Why is it not yet for certain that it's Boris Pistorius, since everyone talks about him as being so popular?
Yeah, that's a little bit the question, why the SPD is a little bit shy in putting names forward. We see, the discourse is currently, like it is actually for almost every party, that the party gets together and they are going to decide what is going to happen and so on and so forth. I could imagine that it's also from the party a strategy also in a way to value Olaf Scholz, because we know when Olaf Scholz was then nominated as a candidate, there was a big struggle, or it was unclear whether it's going to be Boris Pistorius or him. In the end, it was him. And in a way, maybe it's also a chance that the party is giving him and also the whole party to say, okay, we have been happy with this candidate, and we will put the other one forward in a few days.
Right. Well, in any case, now what we have is certainly a changing of the guard. Congratulations coming in from near and far, including from the French president. Emmanuel Macron overnight tweeted that he'd spoken to Merz to say congrats and to Scholz to express friendship. There he is, he tweeted in German. Macron's missive concluding with the following. In these times of uncertainty, we stand united to face the great challenges facing the world and our continent. The words Donald Trump are not written in that line, but we all understand that that's kind of, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, higher on his mind than even Vladimir Putin.
Well, the wake-up call has never been up till now successful. I see this necessity of a real wake-up call, of a reset, you call in modern politics, since some years. But it never worked up till now.
So let me ask you
I
this.
hope so it works now. And the last who has been, let's say, waking up the Europeans has been Donald Trump. But for me, the first Donald Trump had been waking up the Europeans. Putin is what is the other story, if you want. Putin is, we missed all the opportunities, in my view, to avoid that war in Ukraine. Several times. And this is not due to Olaf Scholz, it's due to Angela Merkel, by the way.
And we're seeing those images from a little while ago in the Oval Office, and it's Emmanuel Macron sitting alongside Donald Trump. Macron, effectively right now, the president of Europe, even though it's officially the former Portuguese Prime Minister, Mr. Costa. Could the Franco-German couple be back?
Well, maybe in a different way than before. But I do think that both of the leaders, Macron,
I mean, if the Germans spend seriously on defense,
I guess they are willing to. But I do think what is also important, and that's also something we see in the post that Macron did, and you have been asking why isn't he mentioning anybody else but Europe, and I do think that what he is doing there is constructivism. He is constructing Europe the way that he wants it to, because he is not wanting to make a Europe, at least in his mind, as a reaction only to some of other veto players around the world. He is trying to put the focus in here. And that's something that Europe deeply needs in order to find an identity, and also not only to talk about policy areas, but to have a larger group among Europeans who really support the idea. And I do think that this is what he is putting forward, and this is his agenda since quite some time, with speeches at the Sorbonne and so on and so forth, from my perspective.
Don't forget, will have a German chancellor who has won his first political experience in European Parliament. Yep. Don't forget this.
Where you sit, Michael Bloss, and so I ask, because you have always outliers when there's 27. The Franco-German couple, we talk about it all the time on this side of the Rhine. Is it back with Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron both talking strategic autonomy?
Let's see. I mean, the same Macron did to Angela Merkel, and he came forward to Olaf Scholz, and now he comes forward to Merz. And until now, the German response was always a bit reluctant. I mean, but the main criticism that I have here is that he doesn't take the European level with him. I mean, that's I don't understand why he goes alone to Trump, why he has this small round table. I think von der Leyen should have been there, or at least the Commissioner for Defense.
Von der Leyen was in Kyiv today, so part of along with all those leaders. And
I understand that, but the point is that Europe is also bigger than Germany and France, and especially when we talk about Ukraine, there is the question about there is the question of Poland. So let's if we want to use Europe, and we need to use Europe right now. The market, the defense spending. We need to develop now an own kind of strength in the world.
Michael Bloss, we know that Donald Trump.
The whole European Union with us.
Michael Bloss, we know Donald Trump doesn't like lots of people in the room. He likes one-on-one meetings, and here he's speaking to another nuclear power, like he'll be speaking to another nuclear power on Thursday when he meets with Keir Starmer. Wasn't this the best way to have the likes of Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa in Kyiv while Macron is in Washington?
To my knowledge, that was not all coordinated. So that's the first problem. If that would be a coordinated effort, maybe. But also, we should not get our negotiation dictated by who Trump wants to talk to and who he doesn't. That's also part of the new European strength if we want to, present us.
Jakob Hessler.
Because there's a second truth about Donald Trump. Donald Trump respects strength. Mm-hmm. And if we come divided and you've got this guy and then come this guy, he feels he can just play one against the other. And that is the biggest danger for Europe, is that in order to come up and have the most feathers, people may lose sight
So
of...
who would you have sent for that instead of Macron for that photo op there? Who would you have sent to
No,
Washington?
I'm not saying Macron shouldn't be, but he should be an envoy for Europe, and it needs to be coordinated. That they meet before symbolically, and then, all meet before, and then the day after he goes as the emissary, the spokesperson for Europe, who happens to have a nuclear bomb, which is always nice because it gives you slightly more, oomph when you're in the meeting room, I imagine. But then that could work, but not sort of doing it in parallel, and where I think there's obviously also egos involved, and I think that's, sometimes stands in the way of effective coordination.
Miriam Deggerford, tell us about Friedrich Merz's ego.
So I can say that from the citizens' perspective, Friedrich Merz was supported more by men than by women, which was also due to his stances that he had on several policy issues, but which was also due to his ego, which was kind of taking place. It was Angela Merkel who was, in a way, at one point commenting at the end of the three-party coalition and the upcoming elections. She was just saying her comment was, "These are men." So I would say that this is something that needs to be taken into account. On the other hand, I see that he is maybe more than Olaf Scholz, for instance, talking the language of power in a way that Donald Trump would understand it. And I do think the way that when I hear him talking, the first words, particularly what we were discussing already, what he said yesterday with regard to the NATO and so on and so forth, he is having a different idea about power. He is less about finding, he is of course somebody who is finding agreements in the back door, but also pushing things a little bit more forward. And this will be perceived, or can be perceived in general, as a strength.
All right, and will it be Merz and Macron next time in Washington, Joachim Biederlich?
I don't know. But the next who will, I hope, will be in Washington will be Friedrich Merz. And he will coordinate his visit beforehand with Donald Tusk and Emmanuel Macron.
All right, we'll have to leave it there for now. I want to thank you so much, Joachim Biederlich. I want to thank as well Miriam Deggerford, Jakob Hessler, Michael Bloss for being with us from Brussels. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.